Have you ever thought to yourself about your emotional intelligence and maybe even asked yourself, how emotionally intelligent am I? I'm sure we've thought about our intellectual intelligence, or our intellectual quotient, IQ, but maybe not so much on the emotional intelligence. This is Gary Sams, again, the Chief Wellness Officer for Ebix Benefits Administration and Wellness, and I'm really happy to be back with you this month to talk about this topic of emotional intelligence, and more specifically, what is emotional intelligence and how can I improve it? And so, kind of a spoiler alert, emotional intelligence is something that you can measure and can be improved. So let's start with that. There's some good news when it comes to emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? That's certainly what we want to talk about. And what is the difference between IQ, intellectual quotient, and EQ, emotional intelligence? As I said before, I'm sure you've thought about your IQ, and even if you haven't had your IQ tested, and I haven't, we all sort of have an idea, or at least a belief of how intelligent we are. And just a little kind of trivia background story about IQ. A lot of us, I know I certainly wasn't aware of this until starting to research this topic, but the notion of IQ and IQ testing, it's been around for a long time. It actually, in the early 1900s, French psychologist Binet was the first to kind of look at this, and he was asked by the French government to come up with a test that they could provide to children to see what classes they should be placed in when they started school. If they needed advanced classes and placement, or not advanced. And so that was really the first intelligence test. And then that idea and testing came to the US in 1916, and Stanford University really kind of got behind this, and they came up with the Stanford Binet test, which is now the most popular test of IQ. And it's been changed over the years, it's been adapted, and it's something that it's a test that you could take and test your IQ. And by the way, if you're curious, so an IQ test, it's designed so that the average score is 100. And so if you look at all the people that have taken that Stanford Binet test, typically the average range is anywhere between 85 and 115. And if the score were lower than 85, it would mean that somebody was intellectually challenged according to that test. And if you were above 115, well, you were considered really kind of exceptional and bright. And just to further kind of the discussion and put it in context, Albert Einstein had an IQ of 160. So that's what we're shooting for. But IQ itself is a measure of a person's reasoning ability. In short, as I say here, it is supposed to gauge how well someone can use information and logic to answer questions or make decisions and predictions. So that's IQ, it's a reasoning ability. But when we think of emotional intelligence, it's really completely different. And the definition, there's lots of different definitions out there, but the one that I was really drawn to is from Drs. Travis Bradbury and Dr. Gene Greaves, and they wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and the definition that they have there is your ability to recognize and understand emotions, and your skill at using this awareness to manage yourself and your relationship with others. So that ability to really recognize and understand emotions is really at the heart of emotional intelligence. And being emotional, by the way, and we know emotional people, meaning that they may cry easily and often, or laugh easily and often, what have you. Just because you're emotional doesn't necessarily mean that you're emotionally intelligent, because again, we have to consider the full scope of the definition. It's recognizing and understanding emotions and your skill at using that information around managing yourself and your relationship with others. Another book that you might be familiar with that kind of, and this, I believe this was published back in mid-90s by Daniel Coleman. It's the book with the title Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. And this really kind of, his book, in this particular book, and he really popularized this notion of EQ, emotional intelligence. And he said that there were 4 fundamental aspects. The first one being self-awareness. And when he talks about self-awareness, it's knowing what we're feeling and why we're feeling that way. So get really awareness. The second component to this, or fundamental aspects, was self-management. And that's handling distressful feelings and emotions in an effective way and developing positive emotions and feelings. So the management process. The third one, and important, social awareness. And you might also kind of think of this as empathy. And that's knowing what someone else is feeling, their emotions. And then finally, it's about relationship management, kind of social relationship skill building, if you will. And that's putting it all together to build and maintain positive relationships. So looking at those 4 aspects, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management, we encompass that to really embody emotional intelligence. And I put a little statement here from Daniel Coleman that I liked, but this expanded model of what it means to be intelligent puts emotions at the center of aptitudes for living. And, or in other words, our ability to really live effectively. And I bet you're like me, you know some people that are super smart, super bright. Their IQ, if we knew what the measurement was, it's surely above the 115 mark. But yet, they're not very successful in their relationships, or even in their own life and their own well-being, their life management, if you will. And I think that it may be due to the reason that they're not very emotionally intelligent. They really can't relate to people. They can't relate to their own feelings and emotions, and so it kind of handicaps them in that regard. But as I mentioned, the good news is that just like intelligence, we can certainly increase our intelligence through mental exercises, study, learning, education, life experience. Our intelligence can grow. The same thing is true with our emotional intelligence. And so I want to talk about that next. What are the ways that you can improve your emotional intelligence, your EQ? 1, manage your negative emotions. And by that, kind of stop the autopilot thinking that we can sometimes get in when we're faced with a challenge or a negative situation, and manage those emotions. So you recognize that we're having a negative emotion and reframe it. And that's along with number 2, be mindful of your vocabulary. And that's your internal dialogue as well as what you're saying externally, and try to be a better communicator. So communicating clearly and effectively really can help you redefine those negative emotions and negative thoughts and your relationships. So being mindful of your vocabulary, kind of stepping back and thinking about what you're thinking and saying, and doing that as clearly as possible. Practice empathy, and to me that's really the key one here. And we've all heard the saying before, walk a mile in the other person's shoes before you make a judgment about them, or so forth. I think that's really key. To me, that's really being empathetic, trying to put yourself in the other person's position. And the more effectively we can do that, and the more we do that, the more we improve our EQ. Your stressors. What are your hot buttons, if you will? And being aware of those issues, and maybe even sometimes those people that know how to push your buttons, develop a strategy for dealing with them in advance of the situation or the challenge. But it really is kind of self-knowledge about what your stressors are. And then finally, bouncing back from adversity. We know that life is full of challenge, and we can encounter negative situations and issues, things that really try our emotions, sad situations and so forth. But we have to learn to really recognize and bounce back from those, not dwell on those situations. That is a part of being emotionally intelligent. And those ideas, those 5, came from 5 Ways to Develop Your Emotional Intelligence by Ashley Stahl, and that was published in Forbes magazine last year. Again, I found that pretty useful. To summarize that, I kind of like to look at what I call the 4 R's: recognize, rethink, relax, and recharge. So recognize the negative emotions, the negative feelings, even your dialogue, your discussion. Rethink those processes. Stop, be mindful, put yourself in the other person's situation, be empathetic to what they might be feeling and thinking, and rethink that. How can I approach this differently? Relax, take a deep breath, take a step back, and finally recharge. So putting yourself where you can be at your optimum is an important part of this. We can't be confrontational and dealing with challenges all the time. We need to step out of those situations, recharge ourselves through the way that we think, maybe meditation, exercise, taking a walk, what have you. But those 4 R's are really important. And finally, I think I really like this quote from Theodore Roosevelt, but he said, "No one cares how much you know," so in other words, how intelligent you are, "until they know how much you care." So that is kind of at the heart of emotional intelligence as well. Caring for yourself as well as others. And if you practice those things that we talked about today, and really it starts with awareness, you can improve your emotional intelligence. And I think that will go a long way at improving your relationships, as I said, not at work, at home, with others, with yourself. Improving our emotional intelligence really can lead to more successful living. Thank you so much for your attention. Look forward to speaking with you next time.